Welcome to Come Follow Me, week 15, which takes us to the end of Jacob. And it starts in Jacob chapter 5 with the allegory of the olive tree. Now, I just did a podcast with Mormonish on Jacob chapter 5, and it's responding to Book of Mormon Central's video about evidences of the Book of Mormon and looking at the textual evidences, particularly of Jacob 5, with regard to the olive tree allegory. You can find it on YouTube or you can listen to it on Spotify. But in this video, I'm just going to go through the evidence that links Joseph Smith through to this chapter of the Book of Mormon, and you can look at the receipts. You'll have to pause to see all of the things, and I won't put any commentary on, just so that you can pause and read properly. Jacob 5 is 77 verses, so it's really long, and it ties in the whole entirety of the Book of Mormon narrative, along with the idea of its link to Israel. It's like a mini Book of Mormon, and so it's a really good example of how you can look at one chapter and get a sense of the entirety of the Book of Mormon, including how Joseph Smith may have organized himself in composing it. I reference a number of sources, and the first one is Matthew chapter 7, Matthew chapter 20, and Matthew chapter 24, which I've labeled green, and you'll see this when I label the text of Jacob chapter 5. Luke 13 features prominently, and also an understanding from Luke 20. But by far the greatest New Testament source is Romans chapter 11, which talks about this wild olive tree that needs to be grafted. And this passage in Romans becomes the basis for the whole of Jacob chapter 5. There is also a significant contribution made by Isaiah chapter 5, which is also repeated in 2 Nephi 15. Isaiah 5 also gives a backdrop of the vineyard. And another major contribution to Jacob chapter 5 is actually Alma chapter 32, which is modeled after Matthew chapter 13. These verses give us all of the nourish ideas that form Jacob chapter 5. Now, it should also be said that Nephi alludes to the olive tree allegory earlier with a dream from his father Lehi, and this occurs in 1 Nephi 10, 1 Nephi 15, and a number of other passages through 1st and 2nd Nephi, before this even happens in Jacob. And here's the text, and here is my assigning those different parts of the New and Old Testament and also Book of Mormon into Jacob chapter 5. This is assigned to the prophet Zenos, but earlier in the Book of Mormon this is related to Lehi. And you can see here as I go through, I've labeled all the colors related to those particular books of the Bible, including Matthew and Luke and Romans, Isaiah, and also Alma. There are significant contributions from Matthew and Luke, huge swaths from Romans, lots of interdispersed material. And you'll notice sometimes it's word for word, sometimes it's phrases, and sometimes it's concepts. But all of these scriptures that were available to Joseph are being weaved into the story. And so the whole of Jacob chapter 5 can be ascribed to all of these sources. And so you can clearly see that Joseph is able to make all this happen because he's familiar with the text of the New Testament and some of the Old Testament, weaving in these narratives of trees and fruit and combining them all together to find a meaningful story which relates to the Nephites and the Lamanites and also to the house of Israel as a combination. And so this is how the longest chapter in the Book of Mormon is also the greatest to be able to show us Joseph's input into the text. And we know it's Joseph because he does this again and again. And he does this also the next year when he's writing to the Colesville branch. Jacob chapter 6 is basically a commentary on what has just transpired in Jacob chapter 5. And remember, Jacob chapter 5 is 77 verses. It's huge, which is really fascinating considering Jacob chapter 4 says that there's not much room on these plates and it's very small. But in chapter 6, Jacob talks about the allegory and how it relates to the Israelite people and particularly the Nephites. And he reiterates that Zenos has spoken this and that he knows from his own prophecy that Zenos' words are true. And he emphasizes this idea of the last days and the time that the servants will be called to nourish the vineyard for the last time. And then the end of the world will come and Christ will appear. And then there's that plea to heed these words and to listen to them and to apply them in your life. And then right after this plea, there is a threat that if you don't do this, you're going to be cast to hell. And there's all this emotional shaming, that the question, will you reject? Will you reject? Will you reject? And will you not listen to the Spirit? The idea that if you find any problem with these things, that you are in the wrong. It's not God. It's not the scriptures. It's not the Book of Mormon. And then Jacob resorts to shame, the idea that you're going to stand before God at the judgment day and feel terrible because you'll now be in the position of knowing that you were wrong. And then it's too late because you'll go to the lake of fire and brimstone, which is endless torment. And the thing that's really fascinating about this, of course, is that this is not LDS doctrine now. There is no such thing as hell. There is no such thing as a lake of fire and brimstone. And so there's no reality of a terrible hell. But the shame is still there, and the shame is still heaped on with the idea that if you're not accepting this, then there must be something wrong with you. It's hugely emotive, but it's incredibly effective. It's especially ironic is that these are the kind of things that the Book of Mormon talk about against other churches. The idea that they rob the poor, that they take their money, that they cajole them and guilt them into things which are wrong. And here Jacob is doing exactly the same thing, because now the Book of Mormon is turning to the idea that it's going to become a church, and you need some mechanisms to compel people and keep them in. Jacob is only 7 chapters long, and the next few books, Enos, Jarom, Omni, and Words of Mormon, are all one chapter. And so we're really coming to the end of the replacement text as it folds into the Book of Mormon proper, which begins in Mosiah. But actually, Jacob is not supposed to be this long, or at least some things are happening that we need to have a look at. Jacob chapter 4 is actually the end. Jacob's explaining why he can't write anymore because the plates are so small and engraving on them is really difficult. And so Jacob chapter 4 seems to end Jacob's writings. But then we have Jacob chapter 5, which is 77 verses. So what is happening here? It seems that Joseph is getting other ideas, probably from the Whitmers, as he's telling these things out loud, and they are inspiring him to write some more. And then at the end of Jacob chapter 6, we see, finally, I bid you farewell. So this is supposed to end the Book of Mormon as well, except that we now have Jacob chapter 7, which reiterates the idea that the plates are small and bids farewell again, using the word adieu, which is a French word. What is happening? Why is Jacob not finishing? What is happening in the dictation sequence? Joseph is getting distracted and adding more information, but then he's also reminded that he's already said that he was going to add some more information, and he's not doing it. If you look at the beginning of Jacob, you see the headings where it says the word of his preaching, he confoundeth a man who seeketh to overthrow the doctrine of Christ, a few words about concerning the history, and he's done the few words concerning history, and he's done a little bit of preaching, but he's forgotten about this man who seeketh to overthrow the doctrine of Christ. And that then needs to be added, and so that gets added in chapter 7. These are all really big tells that Joseph is making this up as he goes along. He's got an outline, and at the beginning of Jacob he's said it, but then he's going off on some other tangents, and he's including some other information, including the allegory of the olive tree, which wasn't recognized in this head at the beginning of Jacob. But the thing that he forgot, which is this idea about a antichrist overthrowing the doctrine of Christ, that he hasn't added, and so he needs to do it in Jacob chapter 7, except that he's already ended it in Jacob chapter 6, so he's going to have to add some more. And that's what we'll get on to next. Jacob chapter 7 has become one of my favourite of the Book of Mormon chapters because it really shows Joseph's development through the process of the Book of Mormon. The chapter deals with the Antichrist Sherem, and there are 3 basic Antichrists in the Book of Mormon: Nehor in Alma chapter 1, Korihor in Alma chapter 30, and then Sherem in Jacob chapter 7. And they're all the same story, or at least Alma chapter 1 is an early iteration, and then Alma chapter 30 with Korihor builds on the story of Nehor, and then Sherem in Jacob chapter 7 is a repeat of that story in Alma chapter 30, but it's better. It's more succinct. It's closer together. You can see it here side by side, and you can read it together, and you can see that the same words and phrases and story arc are being used. Alma chapter 30 with Korihor is a bit longer, but you see the development of Joseph with Jacob chapter 7 and Sherem because it's more succinct, it's cleaner, it makes the points better, and it's just easier to read. But in many places it's word for word, as if Joseph has just read Alma chapter 30 in preparation to recite Jacob chapter 7. You've got to be impressed by Jacob chapter 7 for its incredible storyline. There's a lot of drama that really captures people. There's an antichrist who's flattering and overthrowing the doctrine of Christ, and also that he's leading people away and capturing their hearts. He's learned and he has that perfect knowledge of the language that he can use with such flattery, and he's got power of speech according to the power of the devil, which is hilarious because, of course, when Nephi speaks or Jacob speaks by the power of God and they can command, then it's something special, but this person's taking people away. And Jacob's the hero. He can't be shaken from his faith because he's just had so many witnesses that things are true. And with the Spirit, Jacob can confound his words and make him look dumb. So there's that idea and development of debate, and the idea that these strong-willed, Christ-like people speaking by the power of God can confound the devil. And we see this idea that, if you really understand the scriptures, that you'll know that it testifies of Christ, and this gives them great power. And Sherem is going to be struck down by God because Jacob is just so righteous. And he's going to admit that he was working under the power of the devil. And this is going to be a great example to the people that they should have listened to Jacob in the first place. Sherem is going to confess his sins and kind of repent, except that he's now done the unpardonable sin, and so he can't, and he's just going to be struck down and he's going to be killed. And this story really reinforces all of the stereotypes that members want to see. The idea that we have been strong and faithful in the gospel, and there's this person who is fighting against Christ, and he's going to come to his comeuppance because God is going to make sure that the righteous succeed in the end. It's a beautiful confirmation of bias and that prejudice that we have the truth and it's going to be proved. And it taps into our very prejudice around that kind of vigilante justice. So the end of Jacob chapter 7 really talks about the environment that Joseph is in 19th century early America. And I think we can reverse engineer the Book of Mormon to see Joseph and understand his worldview, but also his feelings about it, and some of them come through in these verses. Verse 24 and verse 25 are really interesting in that they really describe that whole colonial settler narrative, the idea that the settlers are only there to reclaim the Native American people and bring them to Christ and to help them to improve and civilize, and yet the Native Americans are fighting against this, that they delight in wars and bloodshed and have this eternal hatred towards the settlers. This is completely understandable, but wholly wrong. As white European settlers moved further and further west, encroaching on native lands and hunting grounds and food sources, of course people are going to get angry and upset and fight back, particularly when their life was at stake. And so Joseph just does not seem to understand this, and this was not the narrative that he was brought up with. And this kind of understanding permeates the whole of the Book of Mormon because it really is a treatise about white Gentiles being more righteous, being more civilized, and being closer to God, and that those native Lamanites are fighting against the word of God. But sometimes they're better, but in most cases they are close to bloodshed. They want these wars. They are in conflict most of the time. And verse 26, I think, gives us a lovely kind of insight into Joseph's feelings about all of these and his ideas about his life and maybe his parents. The idea that, there's a lot of lonesomeness. They're solemn, they're wanderers. They've come out of their homeland in New England and they've been hated by the people around them. And this is causing conflict. And so these things that he's talking about are very close to his heart. These are things that his family are experiencing. And of course, as the Book of Mormon ramps up and is getting towards publication, he's finding more hatred from the people around him who are not seeing him as a prophet and not seeing him delivering the words of God, but circumventing it. And this brings us to the end of Jacob and through to basically the end of the dictation sequence.